Hi everybody, it's Ayla. I tweet over at A Purposeful Wife. You can follow me over there on Twitter. I wanted to talk today about something I recently discovered. It was brought to my attention on Twitter. I had heard of the Southern Poverty Law Center before. Of course, most people have. And here in America. And I was unaware, though, about a lot of things that they did. I don't keep up with all the things they do, just whatever happens to make the news. And I saw a tweet today with an example of a PDF of some of the things that they are providing for public school teachers to teach in their classrooms. And the PDF that I saw struck me as having obviously some bias to it. And I decided to kind of go over to their website, which is tolerance.org, and kind of just look around on there and see what was going on. And I was struck in that I actually agreed with them on a couple of things, and that was actually surprising to me. They had some things about not stereotyping kids by their poverty level, that things actually do have a lot more to do with race than they do with poverty, and thinking that it's children's low academic performance is solely due to poverty is instead of race is actually not accurate. So I was actually really surprised to see them saying that. However, what really struck me was not only the bias of these lessons that they're providing for teachers, and let me review that really quick. And the bias being that they're selecting images from slavery, they're selecting images from the civil rights movement to teach about race and culture, and they're completely ignoring any other history, historical context, historical struggles, both worldwide and in America. Now, obviously, the black-white divide in America is huge, and it really frames our debate and our discussions on race. And I'm not saying that those issues of slavery and civil rights movement shouldn't be addressed. Obviously, in the complete curriculum, you're going to address those. But it's to the complete disregard of other situations in America that have happened, such as bias against Catholics, bias and discrimination against the Irish, and so forth. And so we end up getting this very skewed black and white narrative. And then, of course, there's the Native American side of that as well, the America being founded on genocide, when, of course, that isn't true. 95% of the Native population died from unintentionally spread disease, etc. And so we have these false narratives, but then we have them as just kind of like divided up, that these are the only race issues that happened, and it was all whites were on all one side, blacks were on all on one side. And they're using pictures and photographs, and a lot of these curriculums that they're providing for teachers are all about the pictures. And I think, well, that's just a really easy out. That's actually really lazy academics, because of course, we haven't had photography for the entire of our nation's history. We haven't had, and even when we did have photography, of course, not everything was being captured in a photograph. When photography first came out, it was used, for people who were wealthy enough to afford it. A few people who were using it to document historical events, such as, okay, let's see, let's move on to some of these other things that they had listed. Intent versus impact. They're taking these kids through these really in-depth, like I said, again, hours and hours long of these examples of here's this one is like self-censorship, that you shouldn't say what you feel because you're afraid of being judged. Okay, and there's obviously there's two different sides to that. There's decorum and civility, and there is certainly, it is important to understand that in polite society we engage with other people in a particular way that is respectful and civil and kind. But this isn't what they're trying to teach. What they're trying to teach is this self-censorship of your words and your thoughts. So, for example, if you're impressed by something that someone has done, which you thought contrary to the context of how they should have been able to do it, something should have been hard for them, and they did it well, that you shouldn't praise them for that. And because it's going to make them think that you thought they couldn't do it in the first place. It's this breaking down of these extremes. It's this nitpicking of social interaction and dialogue and speech that social justice warriors really love. And the reason they love it, and let me introduce you to this concept. Okay, so back when I was a liberal, I knew a family who were very, very liberal. And I don't want to give a lot of examples because I don't want to give away who they are, just in case for some reason they come across this video. And I don't want them to feel insulted, because I honestly do love them. I think they were very good friends of mine, and we've lost touch over the years. But I really did love them, and they were very good friends to me, and very kind people and very well-intentioned people. But they were very much on that first wave of social justice warriors, and had been. They were about 10 years older than me. This was in my early to mid-20s. And so they introduced me to a lot of concepts of social justice. In fact, the first time I ever heard social justice warrior was from the female in this couple in about 2005. And one of the things, they were polyamorous and she was bisexual. And it got to a point where just being openly bisexual for her, and this is in the 2005, 2006, 2007 time period, wasn't radical enough, because that had become really acceptable, particularly for women, and it wasn't a radical enough thing. So this is where her and her husband started to switch to polyamory, so she could actually act on these bisexual feelings with other women. And pardon me, I need a drink of water. My voice is getting raspy. And so she began doing that, and they began having these polyamorous relationships, and she was constantly pushing the envelope. And I don't mean sexually. I mean in exploring, well, I mean, in a way I mean sexually. I just mean not in bedroom practices, if that makes sense. She was constantly pushing the envelope of engaging in more and more radical combinations of relationships. And he said to me once, because he was feeling somewhat frustrated by this behavior, but of course, as a good social justice warrior, he was ever championing on his feminist woman. He was exasperated one day and did confide in me, well, she has to always feel as though she's gayer than thou, like she has to somehow prove that she's constantly more and more gay and more radical, and she has to find something new. And this is what we find with social justice warriors. And I think that, in combination with the internet, is why we've gotten to this nitpicky, language obsessed, behavior obsessed social justice warrior stance. Because it started off as, well, we should be accepting of gay people and things like that. In the late 90s, that became more popular, early 2000s. And then once that was acceptable, once the majority of people, mainstream America, was saying, okay, we should be accepting of different, different races and different sexual orientations and so forth. Well, and of women doing whatever they want, once the general population had been given the feminist narrative and it had accepted that, then it became, well, we need to, hold on a second, it became, well, we need to do more now. We need to further this because we're not radical anymore, okay, right? So these people, social justice warriors, base their entire identity on the fact, and I know because I was one. They base their entire identity on the fact that they are more radical, that they are gayer than thou, or, more vegan than thou, or more feminist than thou. They're constantly pushing that envelope. And that's just an envelope that can't be constantly pushed. Otherwise, you get become fascist. You become so obsessed about every nuanced thing that could possibly happen. And that's where we're at now. That's where we're at with Anita Sarkeesian going to the UN and asking them not only to stop threats of violence against her, like, oh, I'm going to rape you or I'm going to kill you, but she was actually saying that cyber violence includes people just saying, you suck, you're wrong, and that sort of thing. And it comes from that. It comes from their obsessive need to constantly push the boundaries of what is radical, and they have to compete with each other. And this is something that a lot of people who aren't in academia don't understand about academia. Just a moment. In academia, when you're at the graduate level, when you're getting your doctorate, in most disciplines, I would say, off the top of my head, I can't think of a discipline this doesn't apply to. You are asked to come up with your own theories. You're no longer studying a lot of other people's things, but you're increasingly pressured to come up with new ideas and new theories. And so when it comes to science or something like that, well, that could be a very good thing, because certainly if you're pressured to come up with a new, more efficient cancer drug, or to investigate this or contribute somehow into its development as part of your doctorate, well, that's wonderful and that benefits humanity. However, when you get to the liberal studies people, it's not benefiting humanity. When you're majoring in women's studies and when you're majoring in even, anthropology, history, sociology, psychology, any of these sorts of degrees, you're constantly looking. You have to constantly look for new ways to be sensational, new discoveries. You're constantly put out there to make new discoveries. So for example, when I was getting my graduate degree, it was always really difficult to, especially when you were working in a group, to figure out who had come up with that theory. So if you were studying an ancient culture and their women had a certain practice within that culture and the men did something different, for example, and you said, well, I have a theory that the women are treated differently because of this structure that's going on over here in among the men. Okay, suddenly you've made this connection, right, that nobody's made before about this particular society in this particular time period. And so now, like, you need to own that. You have to, that's your goods and services. As a baker bakes and sells in academics, in academics, that's your goods and services, is making these connections. And there just gets to be a point when all the logical connections have been made already. When if there was really a connection between what these women were doing and what these men were doing in this ancient society you're studying, somebody probably made that connection 50 years ago. And so unless you find a completely new civilization, and then that's just, golden. But so they're constantly having to redefine things, make new connections. This is their bread and butter, because then they write about it, they lecture about it, they write books about it. They're hired based on the success of that theory or that understanding or the popularity of that. And there's a lot of infighting among academics, because if you're in a group of people and you make this connection to this ancient society, oh, the women did this and the men did this, and I'm making this connection to this social justice, feminist, egalitarian kind of narrative, you need to own that, and nobody else within that group can own that. And it got to be a problem for people that I knew, professors and others, who would go on explorations together and go on trips and would actually, I apologize for my kids in the background, would actually go on trips and things and with other academics, and while they were there, they would say, well, oh, I forget who mentioned that, who said it first, I need to write it down, who came up with that, was it you or was it me? Because somebody has to get the credit, and this is their bread and butter. In economics, this is their widget, this is what they're manufacturing, right? In academia. Okay, so, and social justice warriors definitely are the hub. Their hub is universities and academia. This is, and even if when they're not, when there's somebody like Anita Sarkeesian, she just needs a new topic to talk about, right? Every week on her website, she can't come back and say, oh, well, yeah, women still oppressed, Men's still bad. No, she needs something new. She needs something more salacious. So they dig, they dig, they dig, they nitpick, they nitpick, they nitpick. So they've come up with these gargantuan curriculums of every little nitpicky thing that they think that they're going to teach children this, first of all, which is bizarre. But so I'm just going through all this nonsense, and I got to thinking, well, when the children are learning all of these, all this little like cherry-picked clusters of data, and all this, you can't say that, and you can't do this, and you can't imply that, when they're going over that for hours and hours and hours a day, when is any other learning happening? Like, honestly, are we raising children that are solely going to learn about race relations and about how whites have oppressed everybody ever, and that's it? We're not going to raise children that know anything else, or any other history, or any other ideas in sociology or psychology. And so what I thought was funny is I went and I pulled up, and you can Google, there's a lot of these online, but I pulled up the testing standards for 8th grade. So this is a little bit younger than the suggested grades that were here for the Southern Poverty Law Center. For 8th grade test in 1895. So this is from Salina, Kansas in 1895. And let's see, it was taken from the original document on file with the Genealogical Society. And it goes through what they expect an 8th grader to know. Okay, and obviously there's your grammar. You're going to, and they time them. They have 1 hour to complete these different sections. And, rules of punctuation, so forth, pretty standard arithmetic. There were word problems and those sorts of things. You get to U.S. history. It says, give the epochs into which U.S. history is divided. Give an account of the discovery of America by Columbus. I don't even know that they teach that anymore. I think they probably just teach how awful he was, and it, such as the Civil War. But for the most part, average things that were going on were not being well documented necessarily. And of course, then you have the history of America and the world prior to the invention of photography. And again, we have paintings and things like that, which can be wonderful. But again, a painting was similar to when the advent of photography happened, in that it was usually a wealthy person, aristocrat, who was painting a scene. You did definitely have artists who were painting current events and things that can be seen in historical context, and those are wonderful, and they should be brought out and they should be used. And there aren't a lot of them, but we should use what we have. And let me just gather my thoughts here for a moment. So my problem with it is that it's historically incomplete, because they're relying solely on one narrative, one racial narrative amongst many racial and hold on a minute, among many races and ethnicities that existed in America in its beginning and throughout its lifetime. So they're using one medium to convey one narrative, and that medium fits with their narrative because, of course, photography being developed right prior to the Civil War, there's a lot of images of that. So slavery can be well documented, and its ramifications on society through photographs. And then, of course, during the Civil Rights Movement, again, there was a lot of photography happening there. So we have a lot of salacious pictures, fire hoses, and protests. And it's not to undermine what happened in the Civil Rights Movement. That is really important to know about. That is important history. Slavery is important history, but it's being taught in this polarizing manner. It's not being taught in its completeness. The fact that only 5% of white America owned slaves isn't being taught. The fact that some of the largest plantation slaveholders down in the South were Black people themselves isn't being taught. It isn't being taught that Jewish people owned some of the most lucrative transatlantic slave ships, and were making a lot of money off of the slave trade. It wasn't just white people. There were Black people making money off of the slave trade. I run into this online all of the time, people thinking that the transatlantic slave trade was the first time slavery existed in human history, which of course is absolutely ridiculous. They honestly think, because they've been taught with curriculums like this, like what the Southern Poverty Law Center offers, these incomplete curriculums, they honestly believe that white people, Europeans and Americans, began slavery, when slavery, for what we can gather from his history, began in Africa, and that slavery still exists in Africa and in Arab parts of the world now. They won't be teaching that Vermont was the first white, well, I should say, was the first area to outlaw slavery in the 1600s, that many European countries followed, and then after that, the whole of America. And so we end up with what this I wanted to talk about. Okay, so Teaching Tolerance, a project of the Southern Poverty Law Center. It says, welcome to Teaching Tolerance blog, a place where educators who care about diversity, equality, and justice can find news, suggestions, conversation, and support. And then they go to have a huge list of curriculums that teachers can use. And these are complete curriculums. It tells them what to write on the board, what film clip to show, what questions to ask to divide students into groups and have them discuss certain issues. And here was another huge problem I had with this. They have multiple lessons here that teachers can teach. But what I was really stunned by, being a teacher myself, I homeschool 5 children, and I know how long, I can read a curriculum, and I have a good understanding of roughly how long it's going to take to teach that curriculum. And so I'm looking at these curriculums that are, these are hours and hours long. They include discussion times and teaching times and film clips and photography and discussions about that, and group activities and teacher-led activities over. And I'm looking at these curriculums and thinking, this is taking hours and hours of a teacher's day, if this is what she's teaching and choosing to teach. And seeing as how they have, it isn't as though they're putting out, oh, well, here's a couple of curriculums for you to spend some time in your classroom talking about slavery or the civil rights movement. No, there's at least dozens, and I only looked at the first few pages, so that for all I know, there could be hundreds or thousands of these curriculums. I apologize for not knowing, but I saw at least dozens and dozens. And so what my question would be to the Southern Poverty Law Center is, why do you think that a teacher this is mostly middle school and early high school students, would need to spend that much time in their precious time that they have with their students discussing race and racism, and what the Southern Poverty Law Center calls the new Jim Crow, over and over and over again from all these different angles, looking at, for example, mass incarceration was something that they have here a lot. So they're talking about how that's the new Jim Crow, because a lot of African Americans and Latino people are massively incarcerated. Yes, they are, because they commit more crime, right? And maybe that's addressed. I didn't have time to read every detail of these, but I never saw it addressed in any of these curriculum outlines that I've looked at. Of course, they discourage colorblindness, which of course to me is just really silly. I've noticed amongst my children that certainly children recognize from a fairly early age that there are different races and ethnicities. But to them, it really doesn't matter. If you're around a child, most of the time, it really doesn't matter. They're able to interact and be friends with and get along with really well. And my children have a really great group of diverse friends that they've had throughout their lives from other countries, and then different ethnicities and races within our own country here in the US. And never once have I seen them act awkwardly about it until you bring up the fact that they should feel awkward about it. And that's what's crazy for me, that schools would want to harp on this, how having color blindness is a bad thing with children, because you're almost shaming children for how they naturally are. Now, I'm not saying this is universal. I'm not saying that all children are like this. And certainly one of my sons was really fascinated for a while when he was very young, about 2 and 3, with the fact that there were black people. And was not he wasn't exactly he wasn't afraid of them. It was just that he recognized them as being different, and he would love to point that out. So we would be in the grocery store, for example, and he would be like, look, a black person, look. And of course we're like, no, honey, you're not supposed to do that. But for him, I think it was just, and they were different, and it was an object of fascination. So definitely some children will notice and take particular notice. Most children will not at a very young age. You don't start recognizing racial differences, ethnic differences, until you're getting into your teens, your late teens, your early 20s. And I think that's important. I think that's a natural development, that you learn to interact with a variety of different people on the comfort level of a child, which is very innocent and very trusting and very open. And then as you mature and you become an adult, then you can look at it and say, okay, so there's differences. And why are there differences? And what is the history behind this? And I'd like to explore this. And I think most people do have that time in their teens and their early 20s of, well, who am I? And where do I come from? And where do other people come from? And what is the context of this? And that can be a wonderful time of exploration about the differences in races, about having pride in your own race and who you are, about loving your own culture and community, as well as accepting other people's cultures and communities. But exposing them to it at such this notion that they can't be colorblind when they're children, when so many children actually are, I think is detrimental.